The black maid speaking Korean offered a Mafia boss her lunch in exchange for protection. His reaction stunned the whole mall. Vincenzo Enzo Moretti moved through the world like a ghost in a storm. To the citizens of the city, he was a silent predator, a man whose quietness was mistaken for the cold, calculated patience of a reaper. He didn't need to shout to command a room. His power was felt in the sudden drop in temperature when he walked through a door, the way the most boisterous men found their voices shrinking into their chests. Enzo had built a fortress around himself, but it wasn't made of stone and mortar. It was a fortress of absolute silence. For over 30 years, Enzo had lived in a world where the roar of the city, the laughter of a woman, and the pleading of his enemies were nothing more than vibrations in the air. He had mastered the art of survival through his eyes. He watched the way a man's throat tightened when he lied, the subtle twitch of a finger that signaled a hidden weapon, and the rhythmic pulse in a traitor's neck. He read lips with the surgical precision of a scholar, catching the jagged edges of a whispered conspiracy from across a crowded room. To Enzo, speech was just another physical gesture, a clue to be dissected. His control over the city was absolute because he was never distracted by the noise. While other bosses were swayed by silver-tongued flattery or the loud boasts of their lieutenants, Enzo looked at the truth written on their faces. He managed his empire through a series of sharp, decisive hand signals and notes written in a handwriting so precise it looked like a death warrant. His office was a cathedral of quiet, where the only thing that moved was the smoke from his cigar, curling into the air like a silent prayer. His men feared his eyes more than his guns. They believed he could see into their souls, that his deafness had granted him a supernatural clarity. They were right. By stripping away the sound, Enzo had stripped away the lies. He understood the language of fear better than anyone because he had never heard the words used to mask it. He was a man trapped behind a glass wall, watching a world that thought it was keeping secrets from him, unaware that he was reading every chapter of their betrayal in the silence of his own mind. But even in this perfect fortress of quiet, there was a void, a hunger for the one thing his eyes couldn't give him, the memory of a voice he had lost before the silence took him forever. He was the king of a mute kingdom, ruling with an iron hand, never realizing that the greatest threat to his empire wasn't a sound he couldn't hear, but a truth he had refused to see. The morning sun filtered through the glass atrium of the Galleria, casting long, sharp shadows over the marble floors where Vincenzo Enzo Moretti sat at his usual corner table. The mall was a theater of high-end luxury, but today, the main attraction was the heavy, suffocating tension surrounding the boss. Malik Thompson stood 2 paces behind Enzo, a stone-faced sentry whose eyes darted across the mezzanine with predatory intent. Nearby, Margaret Whitmore adjusted her cardigan, her knuckles white as she gripped her designer handbag. She had seen Enzo's men handle disturbances before, and she instinctively looked for the nearest exit. Sophia Chen, standing near a boutique window, held her breath. She could feel the social atmosphere curdling into something dangerous. Through this sea of suppressed panic walked Amara Johnson. She moved with a rhythmic, quiet grace that seemed entirely out of place in a scene defined by fear. Her maid's uniform was crisp, her white headband a stark contrast against her deep complexion, but it was the small, battered metal lunch container in her hands that drew every eye. To the onlookers, it looked like a suicide mission. Margaret whispered a silent prayer, convinced the girl was about to be tackled by security, or worse. Sophia winced, imagining the cold, gray-eyed boss reacting to such a lowly intrusion. Amara didn't stop until she was 3 feet from Enzo's table. Malik stepped forward, his hand sliding inside his jacket in a practiced, lethal motion, but Enzo raised a single, scarred hand. He didn't look up from his espresso, yet the air seemed to vibrate with his silent command to hold. The crowd watched, paralyzed. They expected Amara to beg, to cry, or to drop to her knees. Instead, she stood tall, her gaze fixed not on Enzo's face, but on the space just above his heart. With a steady hand, she placed the lunch container on the white linen tablecloth. Beside it, she set a simple bottle of water. The clink of the metal against the table sounded like a gavel in the silence of the mall. Margaret gasped, and Sophia took a reflexive step back. They waited for the explosion, for the shouting, for the inevitable display of Moretti's legendary temper. But Amara remained still, her face a mask of nervous determination. She wasn't offering food, she was offering a bargain. And as Enzo finally lifted his head, his cold eyes meeting her steady brown ones, the mall fell into a vacuum of anticipation. The disaster everyone expected was hovering in the air, but the girl with the lunchbox didn't flinch. She was the only person in the building who wasn't afraid of the monster at the table, because she knew something the rest of the world had forgotten. Enzo's gaze was a physical weight, a cold blade that usually forced people to look away in shame or terror. But as he stared at the woman in the maid's uniform, he didn't see the usual trembling. Instead, he saw a reflection of a life he had tried to cremate long ago. The mall around him seemed to dissolve. The murmurs of Margaret and Sophia became a distant hum, replaced by a sudden, sharp ringing in his ears that only the ghost of memory could produce. He looked at the metal lunchbox, its edges worn, its handle familiar, and for a heartbeat, he wasn't the king of the city. He was a 10-year-old boy in a cramped kitchen in Seoul, watching steam rise from a pot while his mother sang a melody he had long since forgotten. Amara leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that was meant for no one but him. The crowd saw her lips move and waited for the strike, but the blow that landed was linguistic, not physical. Yamagie mandun geoskirium masayasesul geoyo, she murmured, her accent flawless, her tone carrying the warmth of a hearth. I know you've been hungry for a long time, Vincenzo. Not for power, but for home. The effect was instantaneous. Enzo Moretti, the man who had ruled for decades without flinching, froze. His hand, which had been reaching for his coffee, hung suspended in mid-air, trembling so slightly only someone as close as Amara could see it. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a sallow, ghostly version of the titan he portrayed. Behind him, Malik Thompson's eyes narrowed, his body tensing as he sensed the shift in his boss. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the weakness they had triggered. In that frozen second, Enzo was transported. He smelled the sesame oil and fermented chili, he felt the rough texture of his mother's apron against his cheek. He remembered the day she had been taken from him, the day his world had turned from vibrant color to the cold, gray monochrome of the Italian mob. He had buried his Korean heritage, his mother's tongue, and his birth name under layers of scar tissue. He had become a monster to survive the absence of her love. Now, this stranger, a maid in a crowded mall, had reached through 30 years of darkness and pulled him back into the light of that kitchen. The shock was so profound it felt like a cardiac arrest. He looked at Amara, really looked at her, and saw the nervous but fierce light in her eyes. She wasn't just offering him rice and vegetables, she was offering him the only thing his billions could never buy. She was offering him the truth of who he was before he became the silence. The mall stood still, a gallery of witnesses watching a statue crack, as the most powerful man in the city found himself unable to breathe, haunted by the ghost of a language he thought was dead. Enzo's fingers finally touched the cold metal of the lunchbox, his movements robotic, as if he were a man waking from a decades-long coma. The crowd watched in a fever pitch of confusion. The boss was supposed to have her removed, yet he was touching the battered container as if it were a holy relic. Malik moved closer, his presence looming like a dark cloud over Enzo's shoulder, his hand hovering near his waistline. Sensing the closing circle of the boss's men, Amara leaned further in, her voice low but urgent, switching back to English but retaining that steady, resonant tone. They fired me this morning, she whispered, her eyes darting briefly to the shadows of the mall's service corridor. But they didn't realize I was still in the locker room when the men in the black jackets met. They thought they were safe speaking Korean, thinking no one in this city would understand a word of it. They talked about a king who had grown too soft, a king who didn't know his own shadows were sharpening their blades. Enzo's eyes snapped from the lunchbox to Amara's face, his focus narrowing into a terrifying, laser-like intensity. The freeze had passed, replaced by a cold, calculating fire. He understood the subtext immediately. In the world of the Moretti family, a coup didn't start with a declaration of war, it started with a quiet conversation in a place no one was supposed to be listening. "I didn't come here to sell you a meal, Mr. Moretti," Amara continued, her voice trembling but her resolve holding firm. "I came because I have nowhere else to go. The men I heard, they saw me. I saw their faces. One of them is standing less than 5 feet away from you right now. They've been hunting me through the back halls of this mall since 8 a.m. I'm offering you the truth and a taste of the home you lost. In exchange, I want your word. I want the protection of the man everyone in this city is afraid of." Behind them, Margaret and Sophia watched the intimate, whispered exchange with bated breath. It looked like a confession, or perhaps a prayer. They couldn't hear the words, but they saw the shift in Enzo's posture. From the shock of a ghost story to the readiness of a general. Malik's jaw tightened, his eyes cutting toward Amara with a sudden, lethal recognition. He realized then that this wasn't just a maid with a lunchbox, she was a witness. Enzo looked at the water bottle, then back at the girl who had dared to walk into the lion's den with nothing but rice and a secret. The stakes had shifted in an instant. This wasn't just about a nostalgic language anymore, it was about the survival of his empire. He reached out, his hand finally steady, and pulled the lunchbox toward him, a silent acceptance of the contract. The bargain was struck in the middle of a public mall, under the watchful, confused eyes of the elite, while the architect of his downfall stood right behind his chair. Malik Thompson lived his life in the periphery of Enzo's vision, a silent shadow that had grown long and dark over a decade of service. To the world, he was the loyal hound, the man who would take a bullet for the Moretti name without blinking. But as he stood behind Enzo's chair in the sun-drenched mall, his heart was a cold engine of resentment. He had watched Enzo grow soft, distracted by the ghosts of a past he refused to share. Malik had done the dirty work, the midnight cleanups, and the silent executions, while Enzo sat in his marble tower reading lips and chasing shadows. Malik didn't just want the throne. He believed he had already earned it through every drop of blood he had spilled in Enzo's name. His plan was a masterpiece of patient malice. For months, Malik had been recruiting the dissatisfied elements of the Moretti crew, men who were tired of the Silent Don's eccentricities and his refusal to expand into the digital drug trade. He had used the cover of Korean, a language he had spent 3 years learning in secret specifically to bypass Enzo's lip reading. He knew Enzo could read Italian, English, and Spanish lips with ease, but the complex phonemes of Korean were Enzo's blind spot. Or so he had thought. Malik had been coordinating the final strike for tonight, a coordinated hit at the Moretti estate that would look like a rival family's ambition. By morning, Malik would be the one sitting behind the mahogany desk, and Enzo would be a memory buried in the harbor. But as the maid whispered to Enzo, Malik felt the first tremors of a landslide. He didn't know exactly what she was saying, but he saw the way Enzo's shoulders squared, the way the boss's hand moved with a new, dangerous purpose. He recognized the look in Amara's eyes, the look of someone who had seen too much. He remembered her now. The girl in the service hallway. He had seen a flash of a black and white uniform as he discussed the merger with his co-conspirators. He had assumed she was just another invisible servant, a piece of furniture that didn't matter. Malik's hand tightened on the grip of the suppressed pistol hidden beneath his blazer. The mall was too crowded for a clean exit, but the desperation was rising in his throat like bile. If Enzo took a single bite of that food, if he listened to one more word from that girl, the 37-year empire Malik had spent his life protecting, and planning to steal, would turn into his own coffin. He looked at the back of Enzo's head, the vulnerable space where the dark hair met the tailored collar, and realized the window for a quiet coup was slamming shut. He had to act, and he had to do it before the Silent Don turned his gaze toward the shadow standing right behind him. The metal lid creaked as Enzo pried it open, a sound that felt like a vault door unsealing after an eternity. As the steam rose, carrying the sharp, fermented tang of kimchi and the nutty depth of toasted sesame oil, the high-end mall seemed to vanish entirely. The scent was a physical bridge across time, stronger than any lip-read word or written command. It was the exact olfactory fingerprint of his childhood. He picked up the simple wooden spoon Amara had tucked into the side of the container. Margaret Whitmore gasped, her hand flying to her throat as she watched the most feared man in the tri-state area ignore his expensive espresso to eat out of a battered tin like a common laborer. Sophia Chen leaned forward, her phone forgotten in her hand, captivated by the raw, unscripted vulnerability on the boss's face. The first bite hit his tongue, and Enzo's eyes closed instinctively. The flavors were aggressive and honest, spicy, salty, and deeply comforting. It was a poor man's dish, a jampong-style stew that his mother used to stretch when the cupboards were bare. It was a flavor Malik could never have faked, a sincerity that couldn't be manufactured by a spy. Amara wasn't just a messenger, she was a miracle. The authenticity of the meal confirmed everything she had whispered. Only someone who truly knew the heart of that culture, who had lived among its people, could have seasoned this so perfectly. As he chewed, the emotional fog cleared, replaced by a cold, crystalline resolve. The warmth of the food acted as a fuel for his dormant instincts. He could feel Malik's shadow behind him, heavier now, pulsing with a nervous, jagged energy. Through the reflection in his water bottle, Enzo watched the way Malik's hand twitched, a micro-expression of a man who realized his prey was no longer sleeping. Enzo swallowed the last bite, the spice lingering on his lips like a promise. He felt grounded, his identity no longer split between the Italian monster and the Korean ghost. He was both, and that made him twice as dangerous. He set the spoon down with a deliberate, rhythmic click that echoed off the marble floors. He didn't turn around to face Malik. He didn't have to. The fortress of silence had been fortified by the taste of home, and for the first time in 30 years, the king was fully awake. He looked up at Amara, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, and reached for the water bottle. The lunch was over, the reckoning was about to begin. The atmosphere in the Galleria shifted from curiosity to a terrifying, static charge. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the atrium, leaving a vacuum where only the sounds of the mall's fountains and the distant, oblivious chatter of shoppers remained. Margaret Whitmore froze, her handbag slipping from her fingers and hitting the floor with a dull thud. She didn't dare reach for it. Sophia Chen took a slow, deliberate step behind a marble pillar, her instincts screaming that the theatrical moment had just turned into a battlefield. Enzo slowly wiped his mouth with a silk handkerchief, his movements unnervingly calm. He didn't look back, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "You always were a fast learner, Malik," Enzo said, the words cutting through the air like a piano wire. "But you missed the most important lesson. In this family, we don't just watch the lips. We watch the soul." Malik's face transformed. The mask of the loyal soldier shattered, replaced by a jagged, desperate arrogance. He realized the maid hadn't just brought lunch, she had brought a mirror, and for the first time, Enzo was seeing the traitor standing in his own shadow. Malik's hand finally closed around the grip of his weapon, the leather of his holster creaking, a sound that, to Enzo's sharpened senses, was as loud as a thunderclap. "The soul is for the dead, Enzo," Malik spat, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and adrenaline. "This city needs a king who lives in the present, not a man chasing the smell of his mother's kitchen in a public mall. You're done. Look around you. Do you think these people will save you?" The crowd stood paralyzed. Amara stood her ground, her small frame positioned between the two titans, her eyes locked on Malik's hand. She was the focal point of the storm, the witness who had turned a quiet coup into a public execution. Malik leveled his gaze at her, his eyes full of a promise of violence. "You should have stayed in the locker room, girl. You just traded a cleaning job for a grave." The mall stood still, a tableau of power and betrayal. The shoppers, the security guards in the distance, and the high society observers like Margaret and Sophia were all caught in the gravity of the moment. Enzo slowly stood up, turning to face his shadow for the first time. He wasn't reaching for a gun. He was standing with the quiet, terrifying dignity of a man who had already won. The standoff had reached its breaking point, the silence was about to be shattered, and the Galleria was about to witness the true cost of protection. The breaking point didn't come with a shout, but with the sharp, metallic click of Malik's safety being disengaged. In that split second, the mall's service doors burst open, and 3 of Malik's co-conspirators, men Enzo had broken bread with just a week prior, rushed into the atrium with suppressed submachine guns. The crowd erupted, Margaret collapsed into a chair, covering her ears, while Sophia scrambled behind the boutique counter. But Enzo was no longer the man who lived in a fortress of silence. He was a predator who had found his pulse. As Malik leveled his pistol at Amara's chest, Enzo didn't reach for a holster. Instead, his hand shot out with the speed of a striking viper, seizing the heavy, metal lunch container Amara had brought. With a fluid, powerful arc, he swung the tin. The edge of the steel caught Malik across the temple with a sickening crack, the lid flying off and scattering the last grains of rice across the marble. The silence that followed the violence was different than the one Enzo had lived in for 30 years. It wasn't a hollow void, it was the heavy, respectful quiet of a city that had just witnessed a resurrection. As the police and paramedics swarmed the Galleria, they moved around Enzo like water around a jagged rock. He ignored the flashing lights and the frantic questions of the mall management, his focus remaining entirely on the young woman standing amidst the scattered grains of rice and broken glass. Enzo walked toward Amara, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble with a sound that now represented absolute authority. Margaret Whitmore watched from the sidelines, her fear replaced by a strange sense of awe as she saw the monster reach out a hand, not to strike, but to assist. Sophia Chen captured the moment on her phone, knowing she was witnessing the birth of a legend. "You offered me a meal and a warning," Enzo said, his voice echoing in the vast atrium. "I promised you protection. But a woman who can hear what a mafia boss cannot is too valuable to leave in a hotel laundry room." He didn't send her back to her old life. Within a week, the black maid who spoke the language of the boss's heart had moved from the service corridors to the inner sanctum of the Moretti estate. Amara Johnson was no longer invisible. She became Enzo's ear, his most trusted advisor, sitting at his right hand during meetings where men spoke in hushed tones and secret tongues, unaware that the woman beside the boss understood every syllable of their greed. Enzo honored the bargain with a ferocity that stunned the city. He didn't just protect Amara, he elevated her. He funded the search for her family and ensured she would never have to carry a cleaning cloth again. But the true transformation was his own. Enzo began to speak more, his voice regaining the cadence of the boy from Seoul. He stopped ruling through fear alone and started ruling through the clarity Amara had restored to him. In the quiet evenings on the terrace of his mansion, they would share a meal, always Korean, always authentic. As they sat overlooking the city lights, Enzo realized that his fortress was no longer made of silence. It was built on a new alliance, one forged in a mall over a $5 lunchbox. He had spent his life believing that power was found in what people were afraid to say to your face. He now knew that true power was having someone beside you who could hear the truth before it was even spoken. The most powerful man in the city was no longer alone in his quiet world. For the first time in his life, Enzo Moretti wasn't just watching the world, he was finally, truly, listening to it.